Okay, good afternoon. And as I said, sorry for the late start, which just means that we really have to be expeditious in the way we use our time for this session. This session is entitled Trade and Services for Economic Diversification, Opportunities and Challenges for the Caribbean Community or CARICOM region. So we're taking it regional now and applying some of the thinking to the regional context in one of the most promising sunrise sectors for our region. We know with all of the crises happening, services, green goods, and digitalization, I heard the SG say this morning, are sort of the areas for most potential for SIDS. And so at this panel, we're going to have almost a two-pronged approach. We have the Secretary General, Rebecca Grinston, Her Excellency, with us, and Senator Chad Blackman. I have to read my notes because when I knew him, he was ambassador. Now he is minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment in Barbados. We will ask them to deliver sort of the high-level remarks. They may have to leave due to other impending appointments, and then I will shimmy over to the other side of the panel where our panelists will really delve in on some of the topics relating to the trade and services component of CARICOM's future. So I'm going to start by just asking the Secretary General to deliver her opening remarks, and then we will turn to Senator Blackman. Secretary General, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you to be here. It's really an honor to be here standing side to side with Chad Blackman. We worked a lot together when we were in Geneva together, and now we continue to work on this fora and on many of the issues that you will hear from us today. So the subject of this panel is building resilience through economic diversification, opportunities and challenges for the Caribbean community region. So let me say that the economic diversification is not a new subject. Since 1964, UNCTAD has been talking about diversification. Yes. And it's not new for Barbados, yes, because Barbados in the past 50 years has transitioned from agriculture-based economy to one led by services, notably tourism and international business. So this transformation has significantly improved income levels and quality of life for many Barbadians. But the issue is, sorry, because this is not my speech. Oh, this is nice. Okay. So I'm being tested here.
You just made everything much more relaxed, Secretary General. Thank you so much.
So I had a lot of numbers that I won't be able to remember all, but so let me then say that from the perspective of UNCTAD, if you look at what has happened in diversification in the world, the truth is that there are more commodity-dependent countries today than in 1964 when we were born. So there is something going wrong in terms of diversification and the capacity or ability of the international system to allow diversification in our countries. But obviously, the opportunity for diversification through services is a real one for the small island developing states, but also for many of the other small developing countries. So, but we know that there are services and services. Yes. When we say services, we can say informal services and very low productivity services, or we can say high-end services that really provide for good jobs, for good employment, for good salaries for our people, and allow us to be much more competitive across the sectors, because services is not a sector, it's really a platform for productivity enhancement in our countries. The other thing is that the knowledge-based services is what we want to develop. Yes, and obviously when you see the trends in trade, you see that trade as a whole is not really growing in a dynamic way. I was telling today when we were in the university that in fact the period of hyper-globalization meant that trade grew faster than GDP. That's what happened from the end of the 90s until around 2020. But today, we are not in that world anymore. Trade is growing much less than GDP. Even last year, trade went down while GDP went up. It was the first time in many decades that there was a divergence between trade and growth in the world. Now, we expect this to start reverting, and we expect 2024 to see growth in trade, but we are not in the very dynamic and accelerated world that we had before, where trade was really the engine that, took growth up all around the world. Now, having said that, if you go and disaggregate trade, what is growing in a more dynamic way is services, and especially within services, digital services. This is something that we have seen. We have seen the tendency, and that tendency has now developed into a structural feature of the world that we are seeing in international trade. So let's put it this way, the bet that Barbados has done, and many of the small island developing states, towards services and digital services and knowledge-based services is the right one. There is a lot to be gained there. There is a possibility for diversification, and also this combined with the green services and the green goods are really a possibility, an opportunity. Now, the competition will be fierce. So we should be prepared to take the opportunities that development present to all of us. So I can give you, now that I was given, it's not the one, but it's a previous one. I will give you some of the numbers, okay? The research that we have done in UN Trade and Development finds that of particular significance for diversification is these knowledge-intensive services that include financial services, telecommunications, computer and information services, research and development, management consulting, and other businesses services. And they hold this potential. These services account, these high-value services account for 15% of the value of all sectors globally. 15% is a significant amount. And their export of these services grew an 8% annually in developing countries between 2014 and 2022, outpassing total services export. So there is something happening really in our countries that we need to harness. The other thing that is important in digitalization is that this dematerialization of trade, in a way, makes tradability much easier for us. It has less logistical cost, less transaction cost if we do it correctly. And for example, the creative industry, the creative services that the Caribbean is so strong on can benefit a lot from a new jump, let's say, on the sophistication of the digital services that are used. To give you some examples, St. Lucia and Barbados are among the 50 countries with the highest per capita royalty collection in the world. Latin America and the Caribbean is the fastest growing region in terms of the collection of royalties after services like music or audiovisual services. 26.7% of these royalties are collected through digital sources and growing. So to put this together, to put the creative industries together with the digital development is a very important thing if we want to continue developing in this direction. Now, between 2010 and 2022, the global export value of digitally deliverable services grew twofold, from $1.8 trillion to $3.9 trillion. That's why I was saying that, you know, the fastest part of trade today is the services and digital part. But just a note of caution, the gains that have accrued from this development goes mainly to advanced economies. 76% of the exports of digitally deliverable services go to advanced countries, and to our region, the Latin American and the Caribbean, we receive how much? 2%. 2%. So there is a scope, a huge scope for improvement, yes? Let me just very quickly go to what we are doing in UNCTAD and how we are supporting and what is it that we can do. So we know that to make informed policies, we need quality data. And we all know that services have a huge problem. We have very bad data about services. We have been working on this very much because the nature of services that is intangible and also is a very diversified category. Yes, diversified category, make it very challenging to have good data. So what we have done is that we have developed a modern trade in services information system called TSTAT. And this tool has been designed to empower national authorities to collect and process statistics on international trade and services in line with international standards. And by providing an online data collection platform, we reduce the reporting burden experienced by businesses, because businesses will have to report. So this system is used already in 8 Western African countries and can be adapted to the needs of the rest of the countries. We piloted first in Western Africa. This is something that we are doing together with partners, and where we have been supporting this with e-learning courses that we have developed with the WTO and UNDESA in the UN. So now we are opening this to Caribbean participating countries, where we have had a trade expert workshop these 2 last days, and the countries that are participating are Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So this is a very good start. We met here precisely in this framework, and we hope to strengthen the capacities of these countries to generate the necessary evidence so we can have better data to take better decisions and for policy making. So let me close saying services is really a way forward. Not all services of low productivity is not something we have to worry about. It happens without us. So what we have to worry about is really the high value services that also include digital and the confluence of the digital with the other sectors. It's not digital per se, only is the digital as a platform to be able to improve productivity in also other sectors. Tourism obviously is one, but also creative industries and higher value added possibilities. You know that my country, Costa Rica, has been a high value services country, but we have not always been that way. Yes, we transit also from agriculture to a more diversified economy, and from that diversified economy to the high-end part of it. It was education, it was perseverance, it was institutions, and it was coordination. And this is my last point. You know, in a way, what the problem with these strategies is that everything has to happen at the same time. You know, if you have one thing happening but the others holding you back, so you won't have the effect and the impact that you expect. And coordination has to be done by specific institutions. It doesn't happen by the invisible hand in the market. The private sector is key, is a stakeholder, it has to be part of the strategy, but the coordination cannot be done by a specific firm or company. It has to be done by the confluence of the sectors and the stakeholders that have to participate. That is a key role for the state. It's a key role for the government. And from what I've been hearing here in the Caribbean, and from I've been hearing here from the PN Motley, that is exactly what is happening. That is exactly the bet that these countries have done. So I have a lot of optimism of a road for the Caribbean that will be able to provide more resilience, more diversification, and a more inclusive economy for your population. So thank you very much.
I think that was an excellent start, and you provided statistics that UNCTAD has generated, and then you segued into the importance of collecting statistics and how the pilots are operating. And anyone in this room who has been in that workshop over the last 2 days? So it's already happening. Thank you so much, UNCTAD. I think you also ended in a great segue into our keynote, which is the role of the state in coordinating all of this work on services that is the beacon for our economies. No one better than our minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment of Barbados to tell us how Barbados is taking this forward in its own development policy. Over to you, Senator.
That's fine. All right, good afternoon to all of you, members of the head table. It's really good to be here, and this discussion, in my view, comes at a quite timely juncture in the context of the forum. Why? As the SG would have alluded, as the global economy is growing, the goods side of trade is diminishing in terms of its rate of increase, but the services side is increasing, and therefore we have to now ask ourselves, how can the state, private sector, and other actors move forward? But equally, as alluded very, very clearly, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of coordination, and given the external shocks that we constantly face around the world, it will require a significant level of strategic alignment as we do so. Now, when we look at the circumstance of Barbados, of course, Barbados was a country post-independence that started with sugar, then it moved on to tourism / light manufacturing, financial services sector. And whilst most of these still remain in a broad sense, the global community that we now live in requires us to change. And why? As a small open economy, we're not a maker of what is happening externally, and therefore diversification is critical. And services presents a tremendous opportunity. One, the creativity that you spoke about, SG, I think not just Barbados, but in the context of the CARICOM, serves as a comparative advantage that we have to tap into. We've played a lot of lip service to it historically, but when you look at our creative sector, whether that be in terms of fashion, music, the arts, let me just put it that way, the creative economy, how do we now leverage that into one, strengthening what we're doing on the ground here, but equally creating that into a level of high-skilled exports around the world. And the digital platforms that we're now seeing provides for us in a way that historically we've not been able to do. But in order to leverage the digital world, it also requires a significant level of finance. And given the box that we're in, most of us in the region, either as middle income jurisdictions or high income jurisdictions, it means what we are able to do in terms of concessional finance limits our ability to do so. So we have to think outside the box as well. So it requires not just the intellectual muscle of agencies like UNCTAD, but the policy space. And therefore, we have to also work with our international partners like the World Bank and the IMF so that they can understand, in order for the Caribbean or the Pacific, using the context of SIDS, to grow in the area of services, we need the policy room to do so. But it will also require a cultural shift, because many of our service providers oftentimes operate in a small context, and I want to use small relatively. By global standards, and I think one of the speakers at the forum this morning at the university put it quite aptly, that what we may call small or medium in the Caribbean, by global standards, is nano. And therefore, we have to rethink how we operate. But as you look forward to the development of services, for example, online, is it fit for purpose? What are the regulatory frameworks that governments across the region are working to ensure that services can also take off? And I come to that point on the issue of harmonization. Oftentimes, governments in the region or around the world, if you're a small economy and you're creating an environment for your services sector, but in its cumulative sense on a global scale, if you're not having critical mass, is it really making an impact across borders? And this is something, therefore, that we have to look at strategically. Conversations for CARICOM, and I know, for example, I'm sure that these will meet the agenda of the Quartet, for example, but how does CARICOM collectively review its existing framework to ensure that the services sector of the region is prepared to compete even more? Because they're doing it, but being fit for purpose in the 21st century reality going forward. Thirdly, we have to also ensure that the level of finance to unlock services is there. The Prime Minister always talks about it, that the liquidity in our banking system across the region is enormous, but it's not tapping into where it needs to go. So therefore, conversations also need to have not only with the private sector in a broad sense, but also the banking sector of our region, matching that with our development prospects, and start trying to see how can you ensure that as service providers want to expand their business, they have access to finance. Because let's face it, a lot of our financial institutions are not ready to lend the sort of support to our services sector in the way that they should. I'm not saying that they don't, but it's not enough. And therefore, a lot of it now has to unlock and remove, as they call it, deconstruct existing frameworks to ensure that people can move in that direction. Now, diversification has become a buzzword, has used the word sexy, but what does it really mean in the context of SIDS and CARICOM? This must be tied to our development going forward. Broadly, I mean, a few of us in terms of the region might have gold or oil or bauxite here and there, but collectively, services is where our strength is. Not maybe, it is. But we now have to keep thinking about how do we move forward the needle. And one of the issues that I've always seen, and it always boggled my mind, is that we might have success in an industry in a 10-year period. And for a 10-year period, 15-year period, we're the best in that. And we get complacent. But what's happening once you become complacent, the global economy is moving forward, new technologies are emerging, and you're still being caught here. Diversification also requires a constant review of our success, almost a SWOT analysis of our success. And therefore, it will require that service providers hand in hand with government, private sector, because of course it has to be private sector-led growth. Innovation must be key. Governments don't trade. They invariably create a regulatory framework for trade. But it is the private sector, backed by innovation, backed by the university in terms of research and development, that must also drive the services sector, helping us to diversify as we go forward. So all in all, if I had to wrap it up and give you a simple takeaway message, it's that one, yes, we must diversify, but two, that diversification must be underscored by constant review of what skill sets we have within our jurisdictions. And three, and importantly, never taking our eye off the ball in terms of ensuring that the necessary finance to be deployed to the region is there at reasonable rates and accessible to all. So thank you.
Excellent, Minister. Thank you so much for these wonderful remarks and always bringing in the things that governments have to think about, creating that space, but also the finance that's necessary, the harmonization, not just within your country and in the national space, but also across the region. We have people on the panel who I know will be able to speak to some of that. I don't want to hold our high-level opening speakers here if they need to be somewhere else, so I'm just going to make excuses if they need to leave. So, of course, you can stay if you can, but I know you do have to leave. So let's give them a rousing round of applause and thank them for setting us up to an excellent conversation that I will now shimmy down to the panel. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. We inherited a little bit of an incursion into our time. What I'm going to do, and I haven't warned the panelists about this, but I want to make sure the conversation is inclusive. We have before us, as you can see from their titles, experts, negotiators, trade and services analysts, heads of units that deal with services trade. And you can imagine that they've been asked to speak about what are the knowledge-intensive services for the region, where are the problems, where are the opportunities. And they know that's what we're going to ask them to speak about. What I'm going to do with a break in protocol, I'm going to go to the audience. Is there a burning question that you need answered that I can then give to the panelists to merge into their prepared remarks so we actually begin their interactive discussion without derailing them too much? So maybe I'll take 2 or 3 questions and then I will see with the panelists if they can merge that into their remarks so that we can have a more interactive conversation whilst they're also delivering some prepared remarks. So if we can keep them very short so we don't spend too much time on the questions. Let me see, first of all, you can introduce yourself and then your brief question and then at the back there, your burning question. Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to the panelists for being here. My name is Aisha. My question is, how can we saw the example of Secretary General Greenspan talking about how her country, Costa Rica, transitioned from agriculture to high-end services. We are also seeing in the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica, that the country is not getting a lot out of the tourist dollars. So what can we do to maximize how much we're getting out of the services, especially tourism that we're exporting? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. One behind there, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ashley. I just had a question pertaining to, for the last couple of days in the Margot, when we were speaking to the fact that most of the Caribbean countries are heavily dependent on tourism services. So I just wanted to know what is needed to diversify from the tourism services to transfer into knowledge-based services. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one more from CK. Go ahead.
Thank you. Christian Kendall. As the SG confirmed, trade in services has significantly increased given the many technological advances, setting the stage for e-commerce among other developments. CARICOM countries opting to diversify and invest in digital services have another challenge to face given our small sizes. Since the second half of 2019, the WTO appellate body, yes, has not been functioning. We know the WTO members have agreed to have a fully well-functioning dispute settlement system that is accessible to all members by this year. How much of an impact does this blockage have on the UN Trade and Development's ability to assist SIDS in their challenges?
Okay, wow. Thank you for that question. So the first two were about really what this session is about. Where do we see the opportunities moving from the low end to the high end? Knowledge-based services, that's where all the action is. That's where the multiplier effect is biggest. Tourism in particular is a great example of how we do that. And then what is the impact of the stasis at the appellate body? I'm going to look at Chantal for that one. She's a trade lawyer on the panel. What impact might that have on the development, even of the trade and services that you think? Do you think there's any connection at all? So not much pressure on my panel. Let me introduce, first of all, I'm going to ask Chantal Ononewu, the Director of External Trade at the CARICOM Secretariat, as she delivers her remarks on really the regional strategy for services development and what are the opportunities, very much in line with the questions asked, what are the opportunities for cooperation across CARICOM to promote these knowledge-intense services, and where do you think the quick wins are? So Chantal, it gives you a little bit more time than the 4 minutes, maybe 7, to elaborate. Thank you so much.
Very generous. Thank you, Jan. Really pleased to be here and to share some thoughts on this very important topic with you all. I'll try and weave in some responses to the questions that were posed. But to get straight into it, the development of the services sector has been recognized by CARICOM to be central to the region's economic development. In our constituent treaty, there is a mandate to advance services sector development with an emphasis on diversification, promoting an increase in the value, the range, the volume of trade and services both intra-regionally and with third states. And there has been priority assigned to critical services, including infrastructural services and knowledge intensive services. And recognizing the centrality of tourism to the region, there is an emphasis as well on sustainable tourism development. Now, how has this mandate that the community has set for itself been realized? What have we been doing to advance it? The community has been undertaking for some time the development of priority services sectors that are considered to be important as drivers of growth and transition. And that has resulted in a focus on 7 priority subsectors for services development. Professional services, postal and courier services, tourism services, cultural and entertainment services, sporting services, education services, and health and wellness services. Now, what I want to just quickly point out is while we are advancing the development of these 7 priority subsectors, I want to also speak to the importance that the community has assigned to developing certain core infrastructural services. So the community has been pursuing a strategy for realizing a single ICT space for the region, which must involve the development of that critical infrastructural service. And as part of the effort towards coordinating macroeconomic policy, the region has been pursuing initiatives to advance development of the financial services sector, another critical infrastructural service. Now, where have we gotten to? Well, with respect to the 7 priority subsectors that I mentioned above, the community has already approved and is actively implementing strategies for professional services, for postal and courier services and for tourism services, and I'll briefly mention what is really being prioritized there. With respect to professional services, the community is working towards full and effective free movement of professionals. We already have a regime within the community for the free movement of skilled community nationals, but in a context where you have diverse regulatory and administrative systems, there will not be effective and full free movement of professionals. And so we have been working on the single registration of professionals, recognizing that the registration of a professional throughout the community is a one-time act. And so the focus has been, for instance, on putting in place community qualification standards for registration of professionals and harmonizing requirements and procedures for registration and licensing of professionals. And Jan had asked, what's a quick win? I consider that to be one of the quick wins, particularly in a context where the region has already set for itself the target of free movement of all community nationals as something that must be advanced in the short term. Now, in terms of tourism services, the focus here is really on developing. What we're seeking to implement is further development and growth of intra-regional travel and tourism. And one of the members of the audience asked, how do we extract more from tourism? It's really going to be by engendering greater linkages between tourism and the rest of the economy. That's how in my view, greater benefits are going to be extracted. Whether it is linking it to agriculture, linking it to other services sectors, to me, that's how you develop strategies for mining more benefits from that important sector. Really quickly, just to highlight that where postal and courier services are concerned, the focus really is on engendering greater opportunities for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. By focusing on trade facilitation for such enterprises and financial inclusion of such enterprises, many of which are excluded from the formal financial sector. We are looking to finalize the strategies for cultural and entertainment services, education services, health and wellness services, and sporting services. But what I just want to quickly flag is that what's significant about these strategies, which are still to be developed, is that many of these services can be digitally delivered. And many of these services are knowledge intensive. And so we must take the opportunity when seeking to finalize these strategies to ensure that we maximize the benefits that can be derived from them being digitally deliverable, in my view. I won't say a lot on services statistics. Many people in the audience have been talking about this a lot over the past few days, but I just want to flag that underpinning a lot of this work is improving how we track our national accounts relating to services and also how we improve our statistics on trade in services. Believe it or not, we currently don't track services by the mode by which they're supplied. We actually don't have that disaggregated data, and we don't even disaggregate or trade in services data by partner country. It's really lumped together, and so that kind of strategic policy making that's oriented from targeting particular markets, it's difficult to do that in circumstances where the data isn't disaggregated by partner country. Now, I wanted to move on to talk about how these initiatives promote diversification. And I wanted to quickly just make a few points. One, clearly these initiatives are not just focused on diversifying tourism itself. We're overly dependent on tourism, but also diversifying into non-tourism sectors. And in that regard, I want to emphasize that what these strategies recognize is that services provide inputs to the rest of the economy. They're not just products for export themselves. And so by developing some of these sectors, you're actually improving services that can actually help to make other industries more productive and competitive. And so if you are focusing on R&D services or efficient financial services, that can help to improve the efficiency of other industries like agriculture, like mining, like energy. So we shouldn't think of services as being separate from the overall competitiveness of our economy. I just want to end by, because I saw John's probing looks, I just want to end by briefly talking about some of the challenges that we have to overcome if we do want to achieve this diversification we're talking about, particularly with respect to maximizing the potential posed by digitally deliverable services. We have to address or improve our digital infrastructure. We have to address skills deficits, and all I want to say with respect to skills deficits is one of the biggest deficits is with respect to adaptation and use of technology. To me, that's one of the greatest skills deficits that we have to overcome if we are actually going to tap into knowledge-intensive services. Much has been said about the deficiencies in the regulatory framework. All I will say is that many of the strategies I've mentioned envisage that there will need to be convergence or harmonization at the regional level. And of course, we will have to address, in ways that we're already seeking to do, the deficits in disaggregated data on the services sector and services trade. And CK, I don't think that the stasis in the appellate body in any way inhibits the ability of entities like UN Trade and Development to advance, to provide support to efforts of countries to engage in diversification through services sector development.
Really great remarks, Chantal. Thank you so much. I won't talk too long because I want to leave time at the end for any questions. I know we're going to move very quickly to Ricardo of the OECS Commission, and he heads the Trade Policy Unit, and he's going to tell us about that sub-region of the OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, what they're doing with services for their economic diversification. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Yves, and good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Having followed Chantal, who spoke about CARICOM and the OECS being members of CARICOM, there's some, well, everything she says and she said does apply.
Oh, you have to talk louder.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me better now? Yes. Sorry about that. So I was saying that having come after Chantal from CARICOM, everything she said does apply to the OECS, so because of time, I'm not going to repeat. But the OECS member states, of course, one of the primary objectives of the member states of the OECS right now really is to establish an economic union among the protocol member states. That's the 6 independent states and Montserrat. And the revised Treaty of Bastille does call for that establishment of a single economic and financial space. The member states have committed themselves to coordinate, harmonize, and undertake, joint actions and policies in a wide variety of areas. And so in the area of services, and there's also a commitment to harmonize policy, sectoral policies. So when it comes to services, that's also one of the areas where the member states are working towards development and the regulation of services in a common manner, harmonized manner, as well as to ensure that the free trade in services regime, much like what CARICOM is pursuing in the CSME, is functioning. In that regard, one of the things that I was asked to talk about, and Chantal also mentioned, when we look at what are some of the priority services sectors that the OECS member states are considering in terms of diversification. Of course, we know the big sectors and the traditional sectors like tourism and financial services. Cultural and creative industries, or the orange economy, continues to be an area where the member states are seeking to develop. supporting services for the entire economy, like logistics and transport services. That's one of the key challenges that in the entire region and in the OECS we do have. Higher education services, health and wellness. But I just wanted to highlight on what I would call the ICT-enabled e-services in the digital economy. And so here we're looking at, digital financial services, digital health services. That's one of the areas the member states are currently looking at as well. E-learning, everything e-commerce, e-business, e-government. And even services associated with some of the other economies, like the blue economy, for example. And in that regard, the OECS had gotten assistance to undertake, an assessment of the digital trade and e-commerce readiness and the associated capacity building needs of the member states. And we, in that report, which was done for us by the Commonwealth Secretariat, highlighted some of the, the opportunities and challenges. So when we look at what are the opportunities that we are pursuing, e-commerce, of course, we see as having, one of the key potential for impacting innovation, competitiveness, job creation, and growth in the OECS. And so that's one of the areas that we, the member states on the ground and the Commission is working to really advance. We are, we export traditionally to our neighbors and to our traditional countries. But what we are recognizing is that a lot of purchases are now being done online. And the OECS, we really need to optimize our e-commerce presence, e-business, and to leverage the whole range of digital solutions that are available and which can be developed, because we in the OECS, we in the region can also develop our own digital solutions to some of the challenges that we are facing. There's also an opportunity for the OECS member states to participate effectively in the global marketplace, which is increasingly online, as I just mentioned. And linked to that is improving access and use of digital financial services and strengthening the ecosystem for doing business, particularly in the digital economy. Of course, there are quite a number of challenges that are faced. Yeah, so one of those, of course, is the undeveloped regulatory framework for e-commerce and e-business. What do we have sometimes is also sometimes very burdensome. So when we talk about digital financial services, we do have some burdensome regulatory frameworks that hinders the participation of MSMEs in those cases. We have limited payment solutions. And some of those things, I see that time is running up. Yeah. So in terms of what needs to happen, I think the OECS, we are working towards, as I mentioned, harmonizing our regulatory framework, developing and harmonizing our policy and regulatory framework, and also fostering greater participation of our MSMEs. Data was mentioned as an issue, and we do have a project working with UNCTAD, as well as under our own EDF11, to increase the capacity for collecting data. Yes.
Sorry, Ricardo, but if we're being ushered out of the room, but I'm going to hold firm here because we started late and we had some high levels, so we can't squeeze my panel completely into 1 minute. So Sheldon, I'm going to put out a line here. We're going to give you at least 5 or 7 minutes to present your work on ECLAC and what ECLAC is doing, and please pick the topics that you think the audience really is gagging to hear. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I think to start our discussion, firstly, I was a bit disappointed when SG Greenspan left, because, I was a bit disappointed when SG Greenspan left, because I actually have a compendium of projects I would like to be funded by UNCTAD.
She has representatives in the room.
I almost fall out of the door, but let's see. We're talking about diversification, so let's start. Economic diversification, that's the movement from dependence on one or two major sectors for export earnings, revenue generation, to several sectors and several markets, covering goods and services. There's a lot of discussion recently about structural change, structural transformation. That essentially is a movement towards a preponderance or an increase of high-value sectors for export and high productivity sectors. So essentially, that's where the Caribbean wants to move from the independent and agrarian societies initially to now, if you're looking at the OECS and Barbados, dependent on the tourism sector, to broadening that economic base. The thing is, a lot of our trade negotiations and trade agreements in the past were based on goods. So you would find all of our bilateral trade agreements with the exception of the EPA, were goods essentially, providing market access for our goods exports. And beyond maybe Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, to a lesser extent, Jamaica, essentially those are the economies that benefited from these trade agreements, market openings. The OECS member states were exempted from reciprocal commitments, but essentially they couldn't necessarily take advantage of these trade agreements. The EPA is the only trade agreement where there was a services component. We did some work on that, the first EPA review, and we've seen that only Trinidad and Tobago and DR really had some welfare gains. So let me give you some numbers. If you're looking at goods exports for the Caribbean, only 2% of our exports are high technological intensity. Most of it's low, medium, or resource-based. So essentially, we're never going to be exporting these high-value, high-end products, which would address our balance and payment structural challenges. That, if you're looking at goods, our trade complementarity of our goods exports across the broad spectrum of our export markets has been declining over the last decade or two. Put simply, we are no longer producing and exporting the goods that global markets are importing. This conundrum of sorts is simple. We now, Caribbean economies have to now move towards becoming services-oriented, but essentially moving towards becoming knowledge-based economies. So let's look at the services sector. The Caribbean services exports increased from about 10 billion US estimated, and I would imagine that's an underestimation, in 2005 to 16 billion in 2019. That's over 50% increase in our services exports. That we looked at intra-industry trade. Now, intra-industry trade, essentially the building blocks of value chains, and the necessary antecedent to the integration of production. If you look back at the Treaty of Chagaramas, there was always envisaged that there will be specialization of production of commodities or inputs to build a value chain. That was never achieved to any substantive effect in goods. But the opportunity has arisen in services. So we found that when I run the Global Oil Index for goods, we found only a few Caribbean economies have some form of intra-industry trade. But in services, there are 8 out of the 12 Caribbean economies that, when we look at commercial services, have some level of intra-industry trade with global economies. And there's significant intra-industry commerce and services within CARICOM. So why haven't we been able to take advantage of these emerging areas of comparative advantage?
And sorry, where are these, which specific subsectors are we talking
Come
about?
into that, Chantal.
It's just that we don't have a lot of time, Sheldon. We really have to.
Chantal. I'm trying to walk you through this. Walking through this. Taking the scenic route today.
We don't have the scenic bus,
Wait.
so we need to get
So we
the
understand
metro.
that what we need to do now, and this is something that Caribbean economists have not stressed on, we need to move towards or focus on the production of capital services. And you heard it from me. I mean, you heard it from Ms. Greenspan before me, you trust her before me. But we need to move towards the production of capital services and use these services as inputs for production of goods and other services for exports. And if you understand that, that's how we are going to move forward in terms of developing the services sector. If we're looking at, we also need to ensure that the sectors that we are targeting are dynamic sectors, sectors where globally their share of global trade has been increasing. We have found ourselves where travel services or tourism is a declining or stagnant market. So we are increasing our share in the travel market, but the travel market is a stagnant market. Tourism, in terms of the share of global trading services, has been decreasing. So the new sectors will have to be developing a more integrative tourism product. The COVID-19 pandemic and its spillover effects, which caused some Caribbean economies like Antigua and Barbuda and St. Lucia that were essentially overly dependent on the tourism sector to decline by around 25%. A quarter of their GDP was lost in 1 year. These sectors are, and the thinking has to be, how do we develop a more integrative tourism product? And how do we move up the value chain? So we're looking at cultural heritage. There are a vast range of cultural heritage sites in the region. The education tourism, but the education tourism not just for export, but also to train our local cadre of professionals that can now sustain these new sectors. So the medical health and wellness, so we're looking at stem cell, rest and recuperation, burn centers, ophthalmology, and high-end medical services. The yachting sector, and we're developing a plan for the yachting sector, but not just berthing, but we're looking at repair, manufacturing some of the inputs into the yachting sector, and how we can stretch out the yachting season. The boats usually come in around November, December, and they're gone by March. We need to determine how exactly we can extend in terms of the berthing and repairs over a longer period. Boats can then leave Antigua and Barbuda and come to Barbados, where it's less likely. And there's an insurance issue here, but we're going to discuss that. The community-based ecotourism creative industries. And the creative industries has to be seen as a fundamental component of a tourism product. When you're looking at COVID-19, I said, it was sliding those moments, that proverbial canary in a coal mine. We found here that in a recent survey from respondents from 6 major source markets, 81% said they felt that tourism spend should develop individual communities, and they wanted a more immersive experience. So there's a shift in tourism demand. And
Sorry, Sheldon, we have to taper down. No, we have to taper it down.
Non-tourism services, and I'll end here for now, and then we'll come back in. You're looking at charges for intellectual property, financial services, you can write this down, the creative industries in personal, cultural, recreational services, ICT, so telecom, computer informational services, other tertiary services, including business services. And these are some of the sectors we could look at within the services sector, and we need to tie these into where these services can be used as inputs into some goods. And I can end there, and we can come back.
Thank you. So let me apologize to the panelists that we got so late in the start, but we just have to deal with the timetable. I'm curious, Sheldon, if your remarks and your data is available in any ECLAC report that we can point the audience to.
There's a recent study 2 weeks ago, me and Rochelle Harris, on building economic resilience through diversification and tourism. That study is available in ECLAC. It has some of this data here and the sectors and the rationale. There's another study that came out earlier, I think, exploring the notion of a regional emissions trading scheme. Oh, yeah, there's a study that came up that I did launched in January, which looks at the exploring the notion of a regional emissions trading scheme, which looks at how we can finance the greening of our Caribbean economies. That has some data there as well. But hopefully in the question and answer, I can talk about financing. I think how do we finance the structural change is important.
Right, so thanks for that. Now, I know we have to vacate the room, although there is a coffee break. So I'm just wondering, I feel really bad that I tried to get the audience in at the beginning so we wouldn't squeeze you too much at the end. So I wonder, conference facilitator, are there any questions in the room? Very short, so I can throw it back to the panel. Yes, please. Can you reintroduce yourself?
Is there Jared Regas, Tropical Shipping? Is there any conversation about establishing a carbon price in the region? And if so, what does that conversation involve?
Any other questions before we close it off? Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please. A carbon price and a carbon market. Any questions on how this links to shipping or logistics?
Not quite. But I do want to know perhaps why CARICOM and OECS has not prioritized environmental services as one of its key services, considering the amount of green funding that's coming through the region and the opportunity for us to utilize that skill set as a way to also export.
Thanks for that. I'm going to start with Ricardo because I think he was squeezed the most for the time. So Ricardo, and then Sheldon, and then Chantal will conclude.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question, the last question. Yes, that is a key priority of the OECS, actually, among its 5 strategic priorities, which is, valuing the environment. So in connection with the blue economy, the green economy, even the circular economy, we are working with our member states in terms of a number of areas and projects. So that is a priority for the member states, yes. Well, again, time. Time. I don't have an answer to the specific question with regards to the carbon market, so I will pass that on. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that question. I think in the study, there's a model where we were able to forecast the carbon pricing. The EU is the only economy that has an emission trading scheme that had enough data set for us to determine carbon price. The model seems to be very efficient. So if you plug in the EU's pricing, then you can get what could be the forecasted price for the next season. But I think our discussion will have to start with our own carbon pricing and use the model to forecast. Now, the reason why the EU's scheme crashed almost twice is because the inefficient pricing. Because there has to be an incentive for you to actually reduce emissions rather than just pay the fine. And that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you're talking about financing and logistics, what I would have said if Chantal had given me enough time, Genevieve, that there's a fundamental nexus between, one, the diversification, which we're talking about here, about the modernizing of key economic infrastructure, which should include connectivity, transport, ICT, having an e-commerce platform, e-governance platform regionally, transport, to be able to allow freer movement within the region, and also energy, that green energy transition. This is where a lot of the funding or the focus will have to be, to allow our services sector to become efficient and have that intra-industry trade that we're talking about. So if financing is also key. They need to have some innovative financing mechanisms because of the high debt and limited fiscal space. In regional governments don't necessarily have that funding to be able to create that environment and allow these new services sectors to prosper. And those are the three. You need to understand that nexus, that delicate balance between these issues when you're talking about this diversification and the creation of knowledge-based economies. Another key thing, and from the UNCTAD colleagues and still in the room, I think the development of knowledge hubs and vocational centers, similar to Kazenga, I think, in Angola, and these vocational hubs in India and Brazil, that's key for providing the skill set or developing that human capital, that capital services, that's so crucial to increasing the efficiency of the services sector.
You sure? Okay, so Chantal, I did ask Ricardo if he had anything else he wanted to say before we conclude with Chantal, because I really want to be fair to my panelists. But Chantal, short conclusion, and then we bring it to a close.
Not really a conclusion, just a quick response to the participant who asked about why isn't there a focus on environmental services. There is, but it's really there. What I would just say is that environment is a cross-cutting issue for CARICOM. So their environmental protection is something cross-cutting in our single market regime. So it's not, I don't want to give the impression there isn't a focus on environmental issues or environmental services. There is within the context of the program concerning environmental protection for the single market. In the same way, transport is an important infrastructural service. You notice I didn't mention it because transport policy is has its own focus in our single market arrangements. I don't want to give the impression that because I didn't mention certain services among the priority subsectors that they don't feature as important areas within the single market regime. That was just a quick response to your question.
Okay, well, this is a very difficult moderation task, but I hope my panelists are still speaking with me by the time we end. Let me first of all thank you all for sitting through the extra 15 minutes. I'm sure you got a lot of information, and if we didn't get to every question or comment, please feel free to come up and speak with the panelists. I want to thank Dong for organizing, and I know that UNCTAD is doing a lot of work with people who are in the room on services data collection, which is huge for this region. And let me thank my panelists for all of their forbearance with me, and the two high-level speakers in their absence, let me thank them as well for setting us on a great path, although it really squeezed my panelists, but I think we got all the information out we needed. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.